I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. Guests like you make others uncomfortable." Those words hit Eleanor Whitfield like a cold slap in the face. There was no "Welcome to the Grand Regency" or "How may I assist you?" The young woman behind the polished marble counter hadn't even bothered to check the reservation before passing judgment. At 72 years old, Eleanor had faced her share of dismissive glances and thinly veiled contempt. But she never expected such blatant disrespect from the very hotel where she had spent decades investing both time and capital. Yet here she stood, in a simple navy cardigan, modest floral dress, and well-worn brown leather shoes, being told she didn't belong. The receptionist didn't hide her disdain. Her name tag read Amber, and she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite. But her eyes betrayed the superiority she felt. "This is a 5-star establishment. Ma'am, our clientele expect a certain standard." She let the final word hang in the air like a noose. Eleanor calmly slid her printed reservation confirmation and her government-issued ID across the counter. "I have a confirmed booking. Please check your system." Amber glanced at the papers without picking them up. Instead, she waved over a man standing nearby, who had been watching the exchange with a smirk. He wore a sharp navy suit and a silver tie clip, the assistant manager. Based on his name badge, Bradley Collins, Bradley crossed his arms, adopting the same condescending tone as Amber. "There's no need to cause a scene. Ma'am, we can't accommodate walk-ins without proper credentials. And frankly, our suites start at $800 per night. Perhaps another hotel would better suit your needs." A couple nearby paused their check-in to observe. A young man in his 20s, earbuds hanging from his collar, raised an eyebrow and whispered something to his companion. An older gentleman in a tan blazer clucked his tongue disapprovingly, shaking his head as if Eleanor had committed some offense simply by standing there. "I'm not a walk-in," Eleanor replied, voice steady. "I reserved the presidential suite. Paid in full 3 weeks ago." "Check again." Bradley didn't budge. "We have no reservation under your name." Amber chimed in. "Perhaps you used someone else's credit card? That would explain the confusion." She smiled sweetly, but her eyes were cold. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest, not from anger, but from the heavy, familiar weight of being judged not for who she was, but for who others assumed she must be. She thought of all the times she had fought through prejudice, at banks when applying for loans, at restaurants where she was ignored while others were served, even at the corporate board meetings where her opinions were routinely underestimated until they produced results that could not be denied. But this was not just ignorance. This was arrogance rooted in entitlement. Bradley motioned to the security guard at the entrance. "Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our guests." The guard, a young man no older than 30, hesitated. His name badge read Thomas. His eyes darted between Bradley and Eleanor, uncertainty written across his face, but training took over, and he stepped forward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Ma'am." Eleanor nodded slowly, gathering her papers and ID with deliberate grace. "I understand." She turned to leave, her posture upright, her dignity intact. As she passed a group of guests seated in the lobby lounge, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Why do people try to scam these places? She doesn't look like she can afford the presidential suite anyway. Good on the staff for not letting standards slip." Eleanor said nothing. She had no intention of defending herself to strangers who saw only her age, her skin color, and her modest clothes. As she reached the door, Bradley called after her, voice tinged with mock sympathy. "Perhaps you'll find better luck at one of the motels down the road. They tend to be more flexible." Eleanor paused just long enough to reply, "I'll be back in 15 minutes. Bradley chuckled. That won't change anything. But as Eleanor stepped outside into the crisp morning air, she knew something he didn't. In just a quarter of an hour, this man's entire understanding of who held the power in that hotel would change forever. As Eleanor stepped into the waiting black sedan, parked just beyond the hotel's grand entrance, she leaned back against the leather seat and closed her eyes briefly. The soft hum of the engine was a sharp contrast to the cold reception she had just endured. Yet, this was not the first time she had been underestimated, and likely not the last. She thought back to where it all began. Eleanor Whitfield was born in 1953 in Birmingham, Alabama, at a time when signs still divided water fountains and bus seats. Her parents worked tirelessly, her mother as a domestic worker for wealthy white families, and her father as a janitor at a textile mill. They didn't have much, but they taught Eleanor the value of hard work, integrity, and the belief that dignity was not something others could give or take away. At 16, she took her first job cleaning rooms at a small roadside motel. Back then, the pay was $1.25 an hour. She saved every penny, not for clothes or outings like other teenagers, but for books. She devoured anything she could find: business, economics, biographies of leaders who had overcome insurmountable odds. By her early 20s, Eleanor had earned an associate's degree in business from a local community college while continuing to work full-time. It wasn't easy. More than once, she had been passed over for promotions because management preferred younger, whiter faces at the front desk. She wasn't even allowed to answer the main phone line at the first hotel where she worked as a desk clerk. "They want a voice that sounds standard," her manager had told her. She knew exactly what he meant, but Eleanor didn't complain. She worked harder. She studied trends in the hospitality industry. She noticed which hotels thrived and which failed, and more importantly, she learned why. At 30, she took a bold step and applied for a small business loan to purchase her first property, a rundown motel just outside Atlanta. Banks turned her down repeatedly, citing everything from insufficient collateral to the supposed riskiness of the investment. She knew the real reason, though they never said it aloud. Finally, a credit union led by a progressive board approved her application. Eleanor transformed that failing motel into a profitable, respected establishment within 2 years. She reinvested the profits into buying more properties. By the time she was 45, she owned 5 boutique hotels across Georgia and had earned a reputation as a turnaround specialist, someone who could take a struggling property and make it not only successful, but exceptional. Over the next 2 decades, she expanded her holdings, weathered economic downturns, and outperformed competitors. She became known not just for her business acumen, but for her people-first approach. Her hotels were recognized for both luxurious accommodations and equitable employment practices. She hired and promoted individuals based on talent and dedication, regardless of their background. When the opportunity came to invest in the prestigious Grand Regency chain, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She purchased an initial 10% stake, gradually increasing her holdings over the years. After the previous majority shareholder retired, she acquired controlling interest, becoming the largest single investor and, by proxy, the person with the ultimate authority over every Grand Regency property nationwide. But she chose to keep a low profile. She wasn't interested in fame or media attention. She let others take the spotlight at ribbon cuttings and grand openings. Eleanor preferred to focus on creating spaces where every guest, no matter their race, age, or income bracket, felt valued. And yet, here she was, decades later, being told she didn't belong in the very institution she helped build. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Eleanor's assistant, Marissa, turned in her seat. "Ms. Whitfield, the board members have confirmed they can be at the hotel within the next 10 minutes. Do you want me to notify the general manager? Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. Let's give them 15 minutes to reveal exactly who they are when they think no one is watching. She glanced back at the hotel entrance, where Bradley still stood, arms crossed, looking smug and self-assured. It was a look she had seen countless times before, from bankers, real estate agents, even fellow investors who had dismissed her without learning her story. That look never lasted long. As Eleanor's car rounded the block, she watched through the tinted window as guests continued to enter and exit the Grand Regency's gleaming front doors. Business travelers in tailored suits wheeled sleek carry-ons behind them. Well-dressed couples paused at the valet, laughing softly. Inside, Bradley Collins had returned to the front desk. Amber was rehashing the scene to a colleague, exaggerating her own firmness and painting Eleanor as some sort of disruptive, confused older woman trying to sneak into the hotel. I handled it professionally, Amber said with a self-satisfied nod. Honestly, it's sad. People think they can just bluff their way into places like this. Bradley chuckled, smoothing his silk tie. Better to cut these situations off early before they escalate. Neither noticed the security guard, Thomas, lingering nearby. His brow was furrowed, arms crossed over his chest. Unlike his superiors, he had seen the quiet dignity with which Eleanor had carried herself. Something didn't sit right with him. But speaking up in front of Bradley, or worse, the hotel's general manager, could jeopardize his job. So, for the moment, he stayed silent at the reception counter. The line of incoming guests grew. Amber returned to her duties, greeting each customer with bright, rehearsed smiles. The earlier confrontation was already fading from her mind, reduced to another example she'd share later with friends about people trying to get something for nothing. 15 minutes passed, then 20. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the sleek black SUV returned, gliding to a stop in front of the hotel. The driver hurried around to open Eleanor's door. She stepped out, this time joined by two sharply dressed professionals, a woman in a dark gray skirt suit carrying a leather portfolio, and a tall man in a navy blazer who checked his phone with precise movements. Bradley glanced toward the entrance and frowned. "She's back?" he muttered. Amber followed his gaze and scowled. "Seriously? Should we call security again?" Before Bradley could answer, Eleanor walked steadily toward the front desk. She was no longer alone and certainly no longer to be dismissed. As she approached, Thomas instinctively straightened, recognizing the woman from earlier, but something was different now. Eleanor's demeanor held a quiet authority that seemed even more pronounced in the company of her companions. Bradley plastered on a tight smile. "Ma'am, I thought we already discussed." Eleanor raised a hand gently, signaling him to stop speaking. "I believe you've already made it clear how you feel about guests like me." Bradley flushed slightly but held his ground. "Unless you've come back with a valid reservation under a different name, there's really nothing more to say." At that moment, the tall man in the navy blazer stepped forward. "Actually, there is..." He pulled out a slim folder from his briefcase and laid it on the counter. "My name is Samuel Price. I represent Ms. Whitfield in all her business and legal affairs. Inside this folder are documents verifying her controlling interest in this hotel and its parent company." Amber's jaw dropped. Bradley's confident posture faltered. This must be a mistake," Bradley stammered. "No one informed us of..." "You didn't ask," Samuel replied smoothly. "And more importantly, you didn't bother to listen." The woman in the gray suit added, "Additionally, the board of directors was notified of the incident. Several members are en route and should arrive momentarily." As if on cue, 3 black sedans pulled up behind Eleanor's SUV. Out stepped 2 board members and the hotel's general manager, a man named Richard Stanton. whose ashen face revealed he already knew trouble awaited. The general manager hurried inside, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. "Ms. Whitfield," he began breathlessly, "please accept my deepest apologies for what you've experienced. Had I been notified—" "You weren't," Eleanor said softly, "because I wanted to see how my guests are treated when no one's watching." A hush fell over the lobby. Nearby guests paused their conversations. A family waiting for their car through valet stood frozen, wide-eyed. Even the front desk clerks, sensing the gravity of the moment, stopped tapping on keyboards. Bradley's face had gone pale. Amber clutched the edge of the counter as if it might steady her. "I entrusted this hotel chain with upholding the values I've spent a lifetime building," Eleanor continued. "Respect, fairness, service without prejudice." She turned slightly, her voice carrying across the lobby. "Yet today, I discovered that not all my employees share those values." At that instant, the board members approached, their expressions solemn. One leaned toward Eleanor. "Ms. Whitfield, we are prepared to proceed according to your direction." Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but Samuel Price shook his head. "It's too late for explanations." Eleanor gave a slight nod. "Gather all staff involved. It's time for accountability." As Thomas stepped forward, no longer uncertain, but now standing firmly beside Eleanor, Bradley realized the balance of power had shifted completely. The very woman he had dismissed as unworthy just minutes before now controlled not only the hotel's future, but his own. The air inside the lobby seemed heavier now. Conversations had ceased. Even the faint background music, a carefully curated classical playlist meant to soothe affluent guests, felt intrusive and was promptly silenced by a staff member sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Bradley shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, his earlier bravado dissolving into a nervous stillness. Amber, who had only moments ago spoken with such confidence, stood frozen, her eyes darting between Eleanor and the approaching board members. The tallest of the board members, a silver-haired man named Charles Bennett, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitfield, the board has reviewed the initial details of this incident. We await your instructions." Eleanor glanced around the lobby, her gaze steady but not harsh. "First," she said, her voice firm but calm, "I want the staff members directly involved brought here. The rest of the employees may continue assisting our guests." The general manager, Richard Stanton, nodded quickly. "Of course." He gestured to a senior concierge, who moved swiftly to gather the implicated employees. Within minutes, Bradley, Amber, and another junior associate who had snickered earlier all stood in a tense line before Eleanor. The security guard, Thomas, remained slightly apart, though his worried expression betrayed his concern that he too might be reprimanded. Eleanor folded her hands before her. "Before we proceed, let me clarify a few facts." She nodded to Samuel Price, her legal counsel, who opened the folder he had laid on the counter earlier. "This document," Samuel began, his voice measured, "confirms that Miss Whitfield holds a controlling interest, 51%, in the Grand Regency Hotels and Resorts, including this property and 14 others across the United States. As the majority shareholder, she has direct authority over operational decisions, including staffing, training policies, and disciplinary actions." Bradley's complexion paled further. I had no idea that," Eleanor replied evenly, "is exactly the problem. You didn't bother to know." Her gaze moved to Amber. "You assumed that my appearance determined my worth. That assumption didn't just insult me, it violated every principle this company claims to uphold." Amber's lip quivered. She opened her mouth, But no words came. The weight of her earlier arrogance was now a suffocating burden. The junior associate looked down at his polished shoes. Avoiding everyone's eyes, Eleanor continued, "I built my career and this company on a simple belief: dignity should never be reserved for the few. Every guest, every employee, regardless of their background or the clothes they wear, deserves respect." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the message to settle in. Several guests had gathered at a respectful distance, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Among them stood an older black couple who had entered the hotel just minutes earlier. The woman clutched her husband's arm, nodding subtly in quiet solidarity. "I did not come here today expecting special treatment," Eleanor added. "I expected fair treatment. What I received was anything but." Richard Stanton, the general manager, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitfield, the board has reviewed the employee conduct guidelines. There is no ambiguity, discriminatory actions and assumptions, especially toward guests, constitute grounds for immediate termination." Charles Bennett stepped forward on behalf of the board. "The decision, of course, rests with you." Eleanor nodded once. "Then it's decided. Bradley Collins, Amber Schultz, and Jonathan Peters, you are relieved of your duties. Effective immediately, your access to the property is revoked, and HR will process your termination paperwork today." Bradley's shoulders sagged. Amber covered her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. Jonathan, the junior associate, simply whispered, "I'm so sorry." Though to whom it wasn't clear, Thomas stepped forward, his face tight with apprehension. Eleanor raised a hand gently. "No, Thomas, you did not act out of bias. You followed instructions. And more importantly, I observed your hesitation. That shows discernment. You will retain your position, and starting next month, you will join our new Employee Advisory Council focused on fair practices." Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief, then softened with gratitude. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Eleanor turned back to the board members and the gathered guests. "This will not end with disciplinary action. Today marks the beginning of a renewed commitment to the values I built this company on. Every employee, from the front desk to the boardroom, will undergo comprehensive training, not just on customer service, but on unconscious bias, empathy, and professional accountability." A murmur of approval rippled through the watching crowd. Even some guests who had previously kept their distance now nodded in agreement. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "I did not come here today to shame anyone. I came to ensure that what happened to me will not happen to anyone else, ever again." As the terminated employees were quietly escorted out, Eleanor felt not anger, but resolve. Justice wasn't just removing bad actors. It was setting a higher standard and ensuring it endured. As the doors closed behind the dismissed employees, a weight seemed to lift from the room. Yet Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Discipline alone could not repair what had been broken. It would take vision, commitment, and a clear plan for lasting change. She turned toward the gathered staff, guests, and board members who had silently borne witness to the events that had unfolded. Her voice, though calm, carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime building not just a business, but a legacy. "I believe in accountability," Eleanor began. "But I also believe in growth. This is not just about punishing mistakes. It is about creating an environment where such mistakes are far less likely to happen again." The board members nodded solemnly. Richard Stanton, the general manager, seemed visibly relieved that Eleanor's approach was not solely retributive. "As of today," Eleanor continued, "we will implement a comprehensive training program across every Grand Regency property. This will include not only traditional hospitality training, but education in cultural competence, recognizing unconscious bias, and strategies for fostering inclusive service. A few younger employees exchanged glances, some curious, others visibly relieved. They had seen how their colleagues' prejudices had created the situation that morning. Many had long suspected that certain biases influenced hiring decisions and guest treatment, but had felt powerless to challenge them. Eleanor didn't stop there. She gestured to Samuel Price, who pulled another set of documents from his briefcase. We are also establishing a guest advocacy panel, composed of former guests from diverse backgrounds who have experienced bias, not just at our hotels, but throughout the hospitality industry. Their lived experiences will help shape our policies and ensure that inclusivity is not just a talking point, but a measurable standard. Thomas, still standing nearby, looked stunned. Ma'am, does that mean— Yes. Eleanor smiled gently. You will also be invited to serve on that panel. Voices from the front lines are just as important as those from the executive suite. A few staff members began to clap quietly, the sound growing as more employees and guests joined in. What had started as a tense confrontation was becoming something else, a moment of transformation. Furthermore, Eleanor continued after the applause subsided. Our hiring and promotion processes will be reviewed and revised. No longer will assumptions about appearance, age, or background play any part in evaluating talent. We will promote based on merit, dedication, and the values that define this company. At this, the elderly black couple who had stood near the back of the crowd earlier now stepped forward. The woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears. We've stayed in Grand Regency hotels for years, she said softly, but we've never seen leadership like this. Thank you. Eleanor inclined her head. Your loyalty deserves to be met with fairness and respect. Every time, Charles Bennett, the senior board member, addressed the assembled staff. Miss Whitfield's directives are effective immediately. Regional managers will be briefed within the hour. Staff training and advisory panel selection will begin this week. We are committed to rebuilding trust, not only with our guests, but within our teams. Amber lights reflected off the polished marble floor, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch from the past toward a more promising future. Eleanor turned her attention back to the lobby, where several guests who had earlier looked on with judgment now offered small smiles or respectful nods. It was not a sweeping victory. Prejudice, after all, did not vanish overnight, but it was a start, a meaningful shift from silence and complicity to action. As the crowd dispersed, Samuel leaned toward Eleanor. The media has already caught wind of what happened. There's interest from several national outlets. Eleanor sighed softly. Let them report what they will. I did not take action today for publicity. I did it because no person, elderly, young, black, white, wealthy, or struggling, should have to prove their worth just to receive common courtesy. Samuel nodded. Understood. Before leaving the lobby, Eleanor walked over to Thomas. One more thing, she said. I noticed the way you hesitated earlier. That moment mattered. It showed me you have the moral compass we need as part of this company's future. Thomas stood straighter, pride mixing with relief. Thank you, Ms. Whitfield. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Eleanor replied, as she exited the lobby, flanked by the board members and her legal team. The hotel staff and guests watched in quiet respect. The woman they had once dismissed as an unremarkable elderly guest had become a symbol not just of authority, but of the kind of leadership the Grand Regency, and perhaps the entire hospitality industry, needed. This was not just a moment of justice. It was the foundation for change. Weeks passed, But the events of that morning continued to ripple outward. Far beyond the walls of the Grand Regency, media outlets across the country covered the story, not as another viral confrontation caught on camera, but as a rare example of justice served with dignity and foresight. Eleanor refused every interview request. She wasn't interested in being the face of a scandal or allowing the hotel's name to become synonymous with controversy. Instead, she focused on what had always mattered most: progress. At the next quarterly shareholders' meeting, she stood before a room of investors, regional managers, and board members. The mood was tense. Some feared that the recent changes and increased scrutiny on hiring, training, and guest services would damage profitability. Eleanor waited until the room quieted before she spoke. "We are not here today to revisit mistakes," she began. "We are here to embrace the future." She outlined the measurable improvements already underway. Discrimination awareness training had been completed at 60% of properties, with guest satisfaction scores showing a 15% increase across all demographics. Hiring policies had been rewritten to remove bias from every stage of the application process. Even more importantly, the guest advocacy panel was now fully operational. Eleanor introduced its members one by one, former guests from diverse backgrounds who had once been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly. Now, they were shaping the future of the Grand Regency. "We cannot undo what has happened," Eleanor continued, "but we can ensure that our guests and staff know their voices matter, that mistakes will be acknowledged, corrected, and never repeated." She paused, letting her words settle into the silent room. "We are not just a hotel chain. We are a symbol of what modern hospitality should be: welcoming, fair, and rooted in respect for every person who walks through our doors." When she finished, the applause was not polite or perfunctory. It was sincere, rising steadily until even the skeptics among the investors joined in. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited the lobby where everything had begun. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lights. Thomas now stood behind the front desk, not as a security guard, but as the new guest relations supervisor, a promotion he had earned through merit and moral courage. The staff greeted Eleanor with warm smiles, and not the forced, rehearsed ones common in luxury hospitality. These were genuine. As she approached the reception area, a young woman stepped forward hesitantly. She was dressed modestly and clutched a travel bag. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said softly. "My grandmother and I stayed here last week. We noticed how everyone treated us with such respect, and we've never experienced that before at a place like this." Eleanor smiled gently. "That's how it should always be." The woman nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "It meant more than you know." As she walked away, Eleanor took a deep breath. Change, she knew, wasn't always fast or easy, but it was happening. Before leaving, she noticed a new sign mounted near the front entrance. It was simple, but its words carried weight. "All guests deserve dignity, respect, and fair service. If your experience does not reflect these values, contact our guest advocacy panel directly." Below the message was a dedicated phone number, and at the very bottom, in small but bold letters, Ms. Eleanor Whitfield, majority shareholder. Eleanor traced her fingers over the engraved plaque, not for pride or recognition, but as a reminder that justice was not simply about righting a wrong. It was about creating a lasting foundation where wrongs became far less likely to happen at all. As she exited the lobby into the afternoon sun, Eleanor paused only once to look back. The doors closed softly behind her, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new chapter for the Grand Regency and everyone who would walk through its doors in the years to come. If this story moved you and reminded you that dignity and respect should never be negotiable, please give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where justice and compassion prevail. And if you've ever faced a moment where someone judged you before knowing your name, type justice, and where you're watching from, your voice matters.